It's hard to watch, Mrs. Chen admitted, but I think it needs to be seen. Every time someone shares it, there's a chance for another person to examine their own biases. You know, I've received hundreds of messages from people who say watching that video made them think differently about how they judge others. She stood and walked to her office window, looking out at the busy street below. Just last week, I was showing a property to a young couple. The wife was a doctor, but I noticed the husband seemed hesitant to trust her opinion about the house's structural issues. I shared my story with them, and you could see something click in his mind. Sometimes we need these wake-up calls. The interview concluded with Mrs. Chen back at her desk, holding up the original letter of apology she'd written to Dr. Anthony in the hospital. She'd had it framed, not as a reminder of shame, but as a testament to the possibility of change. "If there's one thing I want people to take from my story," she said, looking directly into the camera, "it's that it's never too late to learn and grow. We all have biases, but we don't have to let them control us. Sometimes the worst moments in our lives can lead to the most beautiful transformations." As the camera crew packed up their equipment, Mrs. Chen's phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Anthony. "Don't forget, clinic duty tomorrow morning. We're expecting a busy day." She smiled as she typed her reply. "Wouldn't miss it for the world. Bringing coffee and those pastries you like." The setting sun cast long shadows through her office window, but unlike the shadows of prejudice that had once darkened her worldview, these were just reminders that even the longest day eventually leads to a new dawn. 6 months had passed since that life-changing day in the park. The local news station's camera crew adjusted their equipment in Mrs. Chen's real estate office as she prepared for her interview. The wall behind her desk now displayed not just her real estate awards, but also a certificate of completion from a diversity and inclusion training program. "Are you ready?" the young reporter asked, settling into her chair. She'd specifically requested this interview after hearing about the changes Mrs. Chen had made in her life and business since the incident. "As ready as I'll ever be," Mrs. Chen replied, smoothing her jacket. The confidence she'd once worn like armor was still there, but it was softer now, more genuine. The red light on the camera blinked on. 6 months ago, a video went viral showing you refusing help from a doctor in Central Park, the reporter began. "That same doctor ended up saving your life. How has your life changed since then?" Mrs. Chen took a deep breath. "That day didn't just save my life physically, it completely changed how I see the world. You know, I used to think I was a good person. I followed the rules, worked hard, treated my clients well, or so I thought. But I had these hidden biases I didn't want to acknowledge." She gestured to her office walls, where new photos showed a diverse group of clients and employees. "Look at my team now. 6 months ago, I probably wouldn't have hired half of them. I would have made assumptions about their backgrounds, their capabilities. I would have missed out on amazing talent because of my prejudices." The reporter nodded encouragingly. "You've made some significant changes to your business practices too, haven't you?" "Complete overhaul," Mrs. Chen smiled. "We now offer first-time homebuyer workshops in multiple languages. We partner with community organizations to help families navigate the housing market, and every Saturday morning," she paused, her eyes brightening, "I volunteer at the free medical clinic." The camera panned to show a photo on her desk, Mrs. Chen at the clinic, helping an elderly couple fill out forms, while Dr. Anthony spoke with a patient in the background. "Tell us about your work at the clinic," the reporter prompted. "It started as my way of making amends, but it's become so much more. I see people there who remind me of myself, scared, sometimes distrustful, making assumptions about others. And now I can help them see past those assumptions." She picked up a stack of thank you letters from her desk. "These are from families we've helped find homes near good schools. Before the incident, I might have steered them to different neighborhoods based on prejudices I'm not proud of. Now I ask myself every day, am I judging someone unfairly? Am I making assumptions I shouldn't?" The interview cut to footage from a recent community event. Mrs. Chen and Dr. Anthony were giving a joint presentation at a local high school, sharing their story with students. The audience was captivated as they talked about bias, redemption, and the importance of seeing people for who they really are. Back in the office, the reporter asked, "And how has your relationship with Dr. Anthony evolved?" Mrs. Chen's eyes moistened slightly. He's become one of my closest friends, actually. We have lunch together sometimes, and he jokes about how I'm the only real estate agent he trusts now. My daughter says it's amazing to see her mom and her mentor getting along so well. She reached for a framed photo on her desk, a group picture from the clinic's Volunteer Appreciation Day. But more importantly, he's taught me that change isn't just about feeling bad about past mistakes. It's about taking action, doing better, helping others do better too. The camera zoomed in on her business cards. Under her name was a new slogan: finding homes, breaking barriers, building community. The video of that day still circulates sometimes, the reporter noted. How do you feel when you see it now? He stood up, straightening his white coat. Your apology is accepted, Mrs. Chen. But more importantly, I hope you'll take this experience and use it to help others examine their own biases. Sometimes the most powerful teaching tools are our own mistakes. Before he could leave, Mrs. Chen spoke up one last time. Doctor, the free clinic you run on Saturdays, would you be open to having a volunteer? Someone to help with paperwork, maybe? Someone who needs to learn a lot about seeing people for who they really are. Dr. Anthony smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him. We could always use more help. And Mrs. Chen, your daughter was right about one more thing. You're going to make a full recovery. Physically, and he gestured to the letter still in her hands. It seems emotionally too. As he left the room, Mrs. Chen noticed her heart monitor. The rhythm was strong and steady, just like her newfound determination to change. Outside her window, the sun was shining brightly, casting away shadows, both real and metaphorical. The day of Mrs. Chen's discharge was approaching, but there was something she needed to do first. She'd spent 3 days working up the courage, practicing what to say, and now she couldn't put it off any longer. She asked her daughter to help arrange a meeting with Dr. Anthony. Are you sure you're ready, Mom? Her daughter asked, concern evident in her voice. You're still recovering. I need to do this, Mrs. Chen replied firmly. I need to do this while I'm still here, still a patient, still reminded of everything that happened. The meeting was set for Tuesday morning. Mrs. Chen spent an hour getting ready, trying to make herself look presentable despite being in a hospital gown. Her hands trembled as she applied a light coat of lip balm, a far cry from her usual perfect makeup, but somehow that felt right for this moment. At exactly 10 a.m., there was a knock on her door. Dr. Anthony entered, carrying her medical chart. He looked exactly as he had that day in the park, except now he wore his white coat. His hospital ID badge caught the morning light. Dr. Anthony, Chief of Cardiothoracic Surgery. Good morning, Mrs. Chen, he said professionally. How are you feeling today? She took a deep breath. Physically, much better, thanks to you. But emotionally, her voice cracked slightly. Doctor, could you please sit down? I have something I need to say. He pulled up a chair, his face neutral but kind. A nurse walked past the room, slowing down curiously before continuing on her way. Through the window, Mrs. Chen could see other hospital staff trying to steal glances without being obvious about it. That day in the park, she began, her voice barely above a whisper, I made assumptions about you. Terrible, unfair assumptions. I let my prejudices nearly cost me my life. And worse, I hurt someone who was only trying to help me. Dr. Anthony listened quietly, his expression unchanged. I've watched those videos 100 times now, she continued. I've read every comment. I've seen myself through other people's eyes and she paused, wiping away a tear. I don't like what I saw. That's not who I want to be. Outside the room, hospital life continued. A code blue announcement echoed through the halls. Someone laughed at the nurse's station. A cleaning cart squeaked past. But in room 304, time seemed to stand still. My daughter tells me you're her mentor, Mrs. Chen went on. She tells me how much she's learned from you, not just about medicine, but about compassion. About treating every patient with dignity, no matter what. She managed a weak smile, even the difficult ones like me. Dr. Anthony leaned forward slightly. Mrs. Chen, in my 15 years as a doctor, I've learned that people often react differently when they're scared or in pain. What matters isn't the initial reaction, but what we learn from these moments. But I wasn't just scared, she insisted. I was wrong. Plain and simple. And I need you to know how sorry I am. Not just because you saved my life, but because no one deserves to be treated that way. No one should have to prove their worth because of how they look." She reached for the notepad on her bedside table. I wrote something, several times actually, trying to find the right words. She unfolded a carefully written letter. Would you mind if I read it?" Dr. Anthony nodded encouragingly. The letter was 3 pages long. Mrs. Chen had poured everything into it: her shame, her regret, her gratitude, her commitment to change. As she read, her voice grew stronger, more determined. She talked about her own journey as an immigrant, how she'd faced discrimination herself, and how that should have made her more understanding, not less. When she finished reading, there was a moment of silence. Outside, a group of medical students passed by, their white coats crisp and new. Mrs. Chen thought about her daughter, about all the young doctors who would train under Dr. Anthony, learning not just about medicine, but about dignity and professionalism in the face of prejudice. "You know," Dr. Anthony finally spoke, "the day that happened in the park, I wasn't even supposed to be there. I usually take a different running route, but something made me change course that morning." Mrs. Chen looked up, surprised by this detail. "Maybe everything happens for a reason," he continued. "Maybe this wasn't just about saving a life. Maybe it was about changing hearts and minds too." That night, she asked the night nurse for a notepad. She started writing, first an apology to Dr. Anthony, then a longer letter to her daughter. The words flowed easily now, painful but necessary. She wrote about her regrets, her shame, but also her determination to change. "I don't want to be that person anymore," she wrote. "I don't want to be remembered as the woman from that viral video. I want to learn to grow, to be better." Outside her window, the city lights twinkled in the darkness. Somewhere out there, Dr. Anthony was probably still at work, saving lives, teaching residents, running his free clinic, being the person she had failed to see that day in the park. The heart monitor beat steadily beside her bed, each sound a reminder of the second chance she'd been given. A chance not just to live, but to live differently. To see people for who they really were, not who she assumed them to be. As she finished writing her letter, she realized something important. This wasn't just about making amends with Dr. Anthony. This was about changing the way she moved through the world, the way she treated people, the assumptions she made. It would be hard work, uncomfortable at times, but necessary. The night nurse peeked in one last time before the shift change. "Need anything, Mrs. Chen?" "No," she replied softly, looking down at her letters. "I think I'm finally starting to see things clearly." The next few days in the hospital gave Mrs. Chen plenty of time to think. Her private room on the cardiac floor had become a quiet space for deep reflection, interrupted only by routine checks from nurses and visits from her worried daughter. She couldn't stop watching the videos from the park. Each time she pressed play, she noticed something new. The way Dr. Anthony remained professional despite her rudeness, how the crowd reacted the moment she collapsed, and his immediate response to help her. The comments under the videos were hard to read, but she forced herself to face them. "This could have ended so differently if he just walked away," one comment read. "Look how he helped her anyway. That's what a real professional looks like," said another. "This video needs to be shown in every workplace diversity training," someone else wrote. Her phone kept buzzing with messages from friends who'd seen the viral videos. Some were checking if she was okay. Others were clearly disappointed in her behavior. Her best friend of 20 years had sent a particularly honest message. "I've known you forever, but I never thought you could act like this. We need to talk." One afternoon, while scrolling through yet another news article about the incident, she heard a light knock on her door. It was one of the nurses who'd been caring for her, an older woman with kind eyes. "You know," the nurse said while checking her vital signs, "I've worked with Dr. Anthony for 8 years. Want to hear something interesting?" Mrs. Chen nodded silently. "Last year, he started a free clinic in the low-income part of town. Spends his Saturdays there when he's not on call. Could be making big money doing private consultations instead, but that's not who he is." The nurse adjusted the IV line. "And you know what? Some patients there still question his abilities just like you did. But he never gets angry, never takes it personally. Just keeps helping people." The words hit Mrs. Chen hard. She thought about all the times in her own real estate business when she'd made quick judgments about people based on their appearance. How many times had she been wrong? How many connections had she missed? How many friendships had never formed because of her prejudices? Her daughter had brought her a tablet, and she found herself researching Dr. Anthony's career. The more she learned, the more ashamed she felt. He'd graduated top of his class. Pioneer in minimally invasive heart surgery, dozens of published papers, hundreds of lives saved, and she had dismissed him because, why? The thought made her stomach turn. The viral video had sparked a larger conversation. Local news stations were running special segments about prejudice in healthcare. Social media was filled with medical professionals sharing their own stories of being judged based on their appearance. Some of the stories were heartbreaking, others infuriating, but all of them felt painfully familiar now. One evening, while watching the sunset through a hospital window, she overheard two cleaning staff talking outside her room. "You see that video? The one with Dr. Anthony in the park?" "Yeah, you know what's crazy? Last month he helped my son get into a medical training program. Wrote him a recommendation letter and everything. Didn't even know us, just wanted to help." Mrs. Chen's eyes welled up with tears. The weight of her actions, the ripple effects of prejudice, the opportunities lost because of bias, it all became overwhelmingly clear. She picked up her phone and opened her real estate agency's website. Her own face smiled back at her, next to the slogan, "We treat everyone like family." The irony wasn't lost on her. How many potential clients had she misjudged? How many people had felt unwelcome because of her preconceptions? The hospital TV was playing another news segment about the incident. This time, they were interviewing a sociology professor who talked about unconscious bias and its impact on society. Mrs. Chen found herself taking mental notes, really listening for the first time. The reality of everything hit Mrs. Chen like a physical blow. This distinguished doctor she dismissed because of her prejudices had not only saved her life, but was still ensuring she received top-notch care. Her own daughter looked up to him as a mentor, and she had let her biases nearly cost her everything. Outside her room, life in the hospital continued as normal. Staff rushed past with charts and equipment. Someone laughed at a nurse's station nearby. A cleaning person whistled while mopping the floor. But inside room 304, Mrs. Chen lay in silence, confronting truths about herself she'd spent years trying to ignore. The morning sun streamed through her window, warming her face, but she felt a deep chill as she thought about how differently things could have turned out if Dr. Anthony had simply walked away, as she had given him every right to do. The beeping of her heart monitor continued steadily, each beat a reminder of the second chance she'd been given. A chance to learn, to change, to make things right. The steady beeping of hospital monitors filled the private room at Metropolitan Hospital's cardiac unit. Mrs. Chen's eyes fluttered open slowly, her vision adjusting to the bright fluorescent lights above. Her chest felt sore, and she could feel something attached to her arm, probably an IV line. The last thing she remembered was sitting on that park bench, struggling to breathe. A young doctor in a white coat was checking her vitals. Mrs. Chen noticed her hospital ID badge, Dr. Lai. Something about her face seemed familiar, but Mrs. Chen's mind was still foggy from the medication. "Mom?" Dr. Li's voice cracked slightly with emotion. "How are you feeling?" "Mom?" Then it hit her. This was her daughter, the one she'd bragged about to all her friends when she got into medical school. The one who'd chosen to do her residency at Metropolitan Hospital because of its excellent cardiac program. The one who... Mrs. Chen's thoughts froze. Something was coming back to her. The park. The pain. The doctor who tried to help her. The doctor she dismissed. A wave of nausea hit her, and this time it had nothing to do with her heart condition. "What happened?" she asked weakly, though part of her already knew the answer. Her daughter took a deep breath. "You had a major heart attack, Mom. If it wasn't for..." She paused, seeming to struggle with what to say next. "If it wasn't for Dr. Anthony, you might not have made it." The name hung in the air like a heavy weight. Mrs. Chen closed her eyes, memories flooding back. The way she'd treated him. The things she'd said. The way she'd refused his help until... "Dr. Anthony," she whispered. "The man in the park?" "Yes, Mom." Her daughter's voice was gentle but firm. The chief of cardiothoracic surgery at this hospital, my mentor. The doctor who saved your life after you, she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Just then, there was a knock at the door. A nurse poked her head in. Dr. Lai? Your mother's case is being discussed in the morning rounds. Dr. Anthony asked if you'd like to join. Tell him I'll be there in a minute, Dr. Lee replied, then turned back to her mother. Mom, there's something else you should know. She pulled out her phone and pulled up a social media page. Videos from the park incident had gone viral, millions of views, thousands of comments. News stations were calling the hospital for interviews. Mrs. Chen watched a clip, her hands trembling. The footage was clear, her dismissing Dr. Anthony, the crisis that followed, him saving her life despite her treatment of him. She saw the comments, some expressing anger at her behavior, others praising Dr. Anthony's professionalism, many sharing similar stories of prejudice in their own lives. He's been getting calls from news stations too, her daughter continued softly. They all want to interview him about what happened. You know what he tells them? He says he's too busy taking care of his patients to do interviews. That's the kind of doctor he is, Mom. That's the kind of person you. Mrs. Chen's heart monitor beeped a little faster. Tears started rolling down her cheeks, smudging what was left of her mascara. I was so wrong, she whispered. So terribly wrong. A group of doctors passed by in the hallway. Through the room's window, Mrs. Chen caught a glimpse of Dr. Anthony leading the morning rounds, pointing at charts and teaching younger doctors. He looked exactly like he had in the park, except now he wore a white coat over his clothes, his ID badge identifying him as chief of surgery. He's scheduled to check on you later today, her daughter said, gathering her things to join the rounds. He's been monitoring your case personally, making sure you get the best care possible. It was amazing how quickly prejudice and suspicion could vanish in the face of a real crisis. The same woman who had refused help minutes ago was now literally having her life saved by the very person she had rejected. The crowd that had gathered to film a confrontation was now witnessing something very different, a testament to the oath that all doctors take to help anyone in need, regardless of how they might be treated. The paramedics finally arrived, their boots pounding on the park pathway as they rushed forward with their equipment. Dr. Anthony quickly briefed them on the situation, using precise medical terminology that seemed to surprise some of the onlookers who had doubted him earlier. As they transferred Mrs. Chen onto the gurney, some color had started to return to her face. The immediate crisis had been handled, now it was a race to get her to the hospital. What nobody in the park knew yet was that this incident would soon become a powerful story about prejudice, redemption, and the true meaning of professional dedication. The situation at the park bench was getting worse by the second. Mrs. Chen's breaths were coming in short, painful gasps now. Her perfectly applied lipstick stood out sharply against her increasingly pale face. The 911 operator's voice continued to crackle through her phone speaker, but her responses had become weak, single-word mumbles. The ambulance is about 7 minutes away, the operator announced, voice clear in the tense atmosphere. Ma'am, are you sure there's no one there who can help? Your breathing sounds very labored. A woman in the crowd couldn't stay quiet anymore. There literally is a doctor right here, she called out, frustration evident in her voice. He's trying to help. Dr. Anthony kept his focus entirely on Mrs. Chen, noting how her hand had shifted from clutching her designer bag to pressing harder against her chest. His trained eye caught the slight bluish tinge appearing around her lips, a dangerous sign he'd seen too many times before. Ma'am, he tried one more time, his voice carrying both authority and genuine concern. I know you don't want my help, but I need you to understand. You're showing signs of a severe cardiac event. Every minute counts in these situations. The crowd had grown larger, and now people were recording with their phones. Some were shaking their heads, others were whispering among themselves. A street vendor who'd been selling hot dogs nearby had abandoned his cart to come watch. The whole scene felt like a pressure cooker about to explode. Suddenly, Mrs. Chen's eyes rolled back slightly. The phone slipped from her hand, clattering on the pathway. Her body started to slump sideways on the bench. Oh my God! Someone screamed from the crowd. A child started crying, and their parent quickly pulled them away from the scene. Dr. Anthony didn't hesitate. Prejudice or no prejudice, he wasn't about to watch someone die in front of him. He rushed forward, completely focused on what needed to be done. "Call out to that ambulance. Tell them we have a code blue." He shouted to nobody in particular as he caught Mrs. Chen before she could fall off the bench. An older nurse who happened to be in the crowd stepped forward. "I'm a nurse at City General," she said quickly. "What do you need?" "Help me lay her flat," Dr. Anthony instructed, already checking Mrs. Chen's pulse. "Someone time this." He started chest compressions immediately, his morning jog forgotten as his emergency training took over. The crowd fell silent except for the sound of someone counting out loud, marking the time. The only other sounds were Dr. Anthony's calm, clear instructions to the nurse and the distant wail of approaching sirens. A young man in the crowd who'd been filming suddenly realized his medical knowledge might be useful. "I'm a first-year medical student," he said, stepping forward. "Can I help?" "Get my phone from my pocket," Dr. Anthony said between compressions. "Speed dial to Dr. Lee in emergency. Tell her we're bringing in a cardiac arrest case." The scene had transformed from a tense standoff into a desperate race against time. The same people who had been awkwardly watching the earlier confrontation were now forming a human chain, clearing a path for the approaching paramedics. Each compression Dr. Anthony performed was precise, practiced, professional. This wasn't about proving anyone wrong anymore. This was about saving a life. Sweat dripped down his face as he continued the compressions, his morning run having left him already slightly tired. But he didn't slow down. Couldn't slow down. The sound of sirens grew louder. Red and white lights started flashing against the trees. People in the crowd began waving their arms, directing the ambulance to their location. "Come on," Dr. Anthony muttered under his breath as he continued compressions. "Stay with us. Your family needs you. Stay with us." The nurse checked Mrs. Chen's pulse again between compression sets. The medical student had succeeded in reaching Dr. Lee and was relaying information rapidly. The hot dog vendor had gathered Mrs. Chen's scattered belongings, carefully placing her phone and designer bag safely aside. The sun continued to shine brightly overhead, but the atmosphere around the park bench had grown heavy with tension. Birds chirped cheerfully in nearby trees, completely unaware of the human drama unfolding below them. A street performer's music drifted over from somewhere distant, an oddly inappropriate soundtrack to this moment of prejudice and pain. Mrs. Chen's breathing was becoming more labored, her face growing paler by the minute. The phone slipped slightly in her grip as she struggled to focus on the operator's questions. Yet still, she kept shooting distrustful glances at the very person who might be able to help her most. The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, their phones recording what they surely thought would be tomorrow's viral sensation. But this wasn't entertainment. This was a real moment of crisis where someone's prejudices might literally cost them their life. Dr. Anthony stood his ground, his years of training and experience telling him that the situation could turn critical at any moment. He'd taken an oath to help people, regardless of how they treated him. Right now, that oath was being tested in ways he never expected when he started his morning jog. The moment Dr. Anthony's words reached Mrs. Chen's ears, something shifted in her expression. Despite the pain gripping her chest, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. She looked him up and down. His running clothes were slightly damp with sweat, his breathing still catching up after his jog. In her mind, he didn't fit the image of what she thought a doctor should look like. "I don't need your help," she managed to say between labored breaths, her voice sharp despite her obvious distress. She clutched her designer handbag closer as if protecting it. "I can handle this myself." Dr. Anthony had encountered such reactions before in his 15 years of medical practice. Even in the hospital, wearing his white coat with his credentials clearly displayed, he'd sometimes see that same flicker of doubt in patients' eyes. But right now, his concern wasn't about pride or prejudice, it was about potentially saving a life. "Ma'am," he tried again, maintaining a professional distance while speaking clearly, "I'm Dr. Anthony from Metropolitan Heart Center. You're showing signs of a possible cardiac event. Please, let me help while we wait for emergency services." Mrs. Chen fumbled with her phone, her manicured nails making it difficult to hit the right numbers. "I said no," she snapped, louder this time. "I'll wait for real help. Real medical professionals." The emphasis she put on the word real hung in the air like a slap. By now, their interaction had drawn attention. A young couple stopped their morning walk, uncertain whether to intervene. A woman pushing a stroller slowed down, phone in hand, already recording what she probably thought would be the next viral video. An older man on a nearby bench shook his head disapprovingly, though it wasn't clear whether his disapproval was directed at Mrs. Chen's behavior or Dr. Anthony's presence. "I'm calling 911, Mrs. Chen announced to no one in particular, her voice growing weaker even as she tried to sound authoritative. Her fingers trembled as she finally managed to dial the numbers. Dr. Anthony remained calm, taking a small step back to give her space, while staying close enough to help if things got worse. He'd learned long ago that in moments like these, maintaining composure was crucial. "That's a good idea," he said quietly. "But please know I'm right here if you need immediate assistance." A jogger passing by recognized Dr. Anthony from a recent news feature about the hospital's cardiac unit. "Hey, aren't you the chief surgeon who did that groundbreaking heart procedure last month?" he called out, slowing his pace. Mrs. Chen's phone connected to the 911 operator, but her attention flickered briefly to the jogger's words. For a moment, doubt crossed her face, but she quickly pushed it aside. "Yes, hello," she spoke into the phone, her voice becoming more desperate. "I need an ambulance at Central Park, near the east entrance. I'm having chest pains." The operator's voice came through clearly in the tense atmosphere. "Ma'am, is there anyone there who can help you until the ambulance arrives? Any medical professionals nearby?" Mrs. Chen glanced at Dr. Anthony, then quickly looked away. "No," she lied, her voice barely a whisper now. "No one qualified." More people had gathered, creating a small semicircle around the bench. Someone whispered, "That's Dr. Anthony. He's like one of the best heart surgeons in the city." The whispers spread through the growing crowd, but Mrs. Chen seemed determined to ignore them. Dr. Anthony pulled out his own phone, sending a quick text to his colleague at the emergency department. He knew which ambulance would likely respond to this call and wanted them to have a heads up about the situation. Despite the rejection, his medical ethics wouldn't allow him to simply walk away from someone in distress. The sun was shining brightly over Central Park on what seemed like just another peaceful Sunday afternoon. The parks were filled with the usual weekend crowd, families enjoying picnics, kids riding their bikes, and joggers getting their daily exercise. Among them was Mrs. Chen, a 45-year-old real estate agent known for her designer outfits and perfectly styled hair. Today, though, something wasn't right. She had just finished showing a luxury apartment nearby and decided to take a shortcut through the park to her next appointment. The walk would normally take about 15 minutes. She'd done it countless times before. But today, barely 5 minutes in, she started feeling strange. At first, it was just a slight discomfort in her chest. Must be the new shoes, she thought to herself, trying to brush off the feeling. But with each step, the pain grew stronger, spreading across her chest like a tight band squeezing harder and harder. Mrs. Chen slowed down, her breath becoming short and ragged. The designer handbag that usually felt weightless now seemed as heavy as a brick. Her skin turned clammy despite the mild weather, and tiny beads of sweat formed on her forehead, threatening to ruin her carefully applied makeup. "Just need to catch my breath," she whispered to nobody in particular, stumbling toward a nearby bench. Her perfectly manicured nails dug into the wooden seat as she lowered herself down. The world around her started to spin, the cheerful sounds of the park becoming distant and muffled. Just a few yards away, Dr. Anthony was enjoying his Sunday jog. As one of the city's top heart surgeons, he rarely got time off, and these weekend runs were his way of staying healthy and clearing his mind. He was wearing his usual running gear, plain black shorts and a gray t-shirt with wireless earbuds playing his favorite running playlist. Something caught his attention from the corner of his eye, a woman on a bench, but not sitting in the usual relaxed way people do in parks. Her posture was rigid, one hand clutched to her chest, her face contorted in pain. His medical instincts kicked in immediately. Dr. Anthony had seen these signs hundreds of times before in his 15 years as a cardiothoracic surgeon. He quickly paused his music and changed direction, jogging toward the bench. The woman's complexion was growing paler by the second, and her breathing was becoming more labored, classic signs of a potential cardiac event. Around them, life in the park continued as normal. A group of teenagers rode past on their skateboards, laughing and filming tricks on their phones. An elderly couple walked their small dog, too engrossed in their own conversation to notice what was happening. A street musician's guitar melody floated through the air from somewhere nearby. But Dr. Anthony's focus was entirely on the woman on the bench. His running shoes crunched on the gravel path as he approached, already reaching for his phone in case he needed to call emergency services. He'd stopped countless times during his runs to help people, usually just tired runners or kids with scraped knees, but his gut told him this was different. "Ma'am," he called out as he got closer, his voice calm but authoritative. "I'm a doctor. I couldn't help but notice you seemed to be in distress. Would you let me help you?" Little did either of them know that this moment, this simple interaction on a sunny Sunday afternoon, was about to change both their lives forever. What happened next would not only make headlines across the city, but would also spark conversations about prejudice, redemption, and the power of human connection in ways neither of them could have imagined. For now, though, there were just two people in Central Park, a woman in desperate need of help, and a doctor who had sworn an oath to provide it. The next few minutes would test them both in ways they never expected, revealing deep-seated prejudices and forcing confrontations with uncomfortable truths that had been lurking beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect lives.